Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Lily and Nathan Ackerman lecture series on equality and justice in America at the Austin W. Marks School of Public and International Affairs at Baruch College. The event and lecture series are supported by a generous gift from Rosalind and Erwin Engelman in honor of Mrs. Engelman's parents, who had a very deep commitment to equal opportunity and social justice, and that's what has inspired this lecture series. So I think we're all in one voice in saying thank you to your parents, Rosalind. This lecture series provides an open environment to discuss relevant and urgent issues in the United States on areas of diversity, immigration, public affairs, inclusion, and inequality. I'm honored to serve as this year's Ackerman Chair at Baruch, where I have had the opportunity to do research and public service and applied research, as well as basic academic research on a variety of really of subjects central to the issues of social justice and equality, particularly work on the effect of legal status, on long-term mobility and human rights, on voting rights and the integration of immigrants into the political process, and on second-generation mobility. That was a weird thing to tell. Not someone else usually tells you about who the Ackerman Chair's work is. But anyway, David's gone. The dean is not here, so I did that. But I want to also say, before I introduce Erwin Engelman, I also want to talk about one of the key functions of the Ackerman lecture is to engage students in the world beyond the university. And this is a particularly apt thing to do tonight because our speaker tonight, Manny Castro, the executive director of the new Immigrant Community Empowerment, is a very recent Baruch MPA. So this could be your future. And he's only 4 years out from his MPA, not to put pressure on any of you students. In any case, without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Erwin Engelman and to thank Erwin and Rosalind and their family once again for the gift that made this lecture series possible.
Can you hear me now? It's a real pleasure for me to welcome you all to this lecture. The Ackerman Lecture Series, as Robert mentioned, named for my wife Rosalind's parents, is very special, and if they were here tonight, they would be very proud. John Adams, in his letter of April 15th, 1814, wrote, "Remember, democracy never lasts long. It soon wanes, wastes, exhausts, and murders itself. There is never a democracy that does not commit suicide." Seems to me that the purpose of the Ackerman Lectures is to prove that the august Adams may be incorrect in his assessment. Civil discourse on the challenging issues of our time, most importantly equality and justice, may go a long way to dispel his fears. I don't know how many of you saw the newspaper articles this week about the caravan coming up through Mexico and coming to our border. Came in buses, making a long trip to this southern border all the way from Latin America. One woman, when interviewed, said she hoped to find a job and to support her children. The photographs were heartrending and reminded me that with the exception of Native Americans, American slaves, and indentured servants, this is a nation of immigrants. My wife's mother, as a child in Russia, worked as a slave laborer for the Nazis. well, for the Germans at that time, it was the First World War. And she dreamed of coming to our great country. It's amazing that the immigrants all have a sense of where they want to go and where they want to bring their genes. And we profit from that. Tonight's lecture is one which is pertinent and important at this time. We must have opportunities for civilized discourse on subjects which may be very discomforting to some and express the views of others. Mussolini said, "The way to fascism is like plucking a chicken one feather at a time until no one will notice that the chicken is bald." This must not happen here. And now I'd like to turn the microphone over to Robert, our Ackerman Chair. We're very proud that you're here again, Robert.
Thank you, Erwin. So the Ackerman Chair is a chair in social equality and social justice. And the question that motivates it is how do we achieve better and more equality and justice in a society that's very unequal and very unjust? But it's not a society that's completely unjust. It's a society that has institutions that respond, and it has many people of goodwill who want to make things better. Manny Castro and the institution of which he's the executive director, New Immigrant Community Empowerment, are exactly the kinds of institutions that, and the kind of people that we need to address these issues. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Manny later, but right now I'll say this. He has two things that are very necessary in leaders. One is he's a big strategic thinker. He's always been asking, how do we change? We have a lot of undocumented workers. How do we change the law? But he doesn't stop there because that's a big thing to move. He also says, how can we help these people now? What can we do to try to fix the problems that they're encountering? He envisions the body, he embodies the vision of the Ackerman Chair in ways that I think are quite important and quite vital and necessary. NICE, the New Immigrant Community Empowerment, is an organization that works to defend immigrant workers and day laborers, the most unempowered workers in our community. And how has Manny and NICE gone about doing this? Well, one of the things that they've done is to think strategically. So these may be undocumented workers in the eyes of the federal government, but they are community members in the eyes of New York State, New York City, and others. So to the Department of Labor, they're workers whose wages haven't been paid. And to the Department of Education, they're the parents of school children. And to OSHA, they're workers that need training. So Manny and NICE have been able to collaborate with those institutions to help empower these workers to defend their rights and to be able to get back pay. They recover over $100,000 a year in back pay at NICE and have over 3,000 members. I don't want to say too much about NICE because you're going to hear a lot about it from Manny. But it's this kind of simultaneous big strategic thinking and actionable planning that's very, very important for people running organizations like this. So Manny and I'll tell you a very little bit about his story. I've known Manny since he was an undergraduate when I got a stray email saying, "Can you help me with my thesis?" From someone I'd never heard of before, and I said, "Okay, sure." And now, 20 years later, here we are as friends and colleagues. Manny is the child of Mexican immigrants. He's the first in his family to go to college and grad school, and he has dedicated his life to serving the community from which he comes and also the city, state, and country in which he lives and which has given him the chance to thrive. He is a big strategic thinker, and he simultaneously is working on how to change the law to illegalize people and how to get OSHA and the Department of Ed and the Buildings Department and others to work to improve the welfare of immigrant workers. He embodies everything that's good and great about New York City, and about Baruch. He's, as I told you, he's one of ours. I think it's when he's done, we should give ourselves a pat on the back and him a large round of applause. And I think he embodies what the intent of this Ackerman lecture series was. So please join me in welcoming Manny Castro, the executive director of NICE.
Thank you, Rob. I don't think I need this. Can you hear me okay? Okay, great. Let's see. Okay. Well, first of all, I want to say thank you to Professor Smith. I haven't had the chance to thank him for all his support in his mentorship over the years in such a setting. So I want to take the opportunity to do that today because Professor Smith has meant so much to me and to many other of his students and many of the other young people he's mentored over the years. And just to continue on the story that he just shared, when I was an undergraduate at Hampshire College, I had just moved from Brooklyn to Hampshire, and I was an undocumented student. And this is before the concept of dreamer existed. This came a few years later. And so at Hampshire, I just felt very isolated. I didn't know what I was doing. And I didn't even know if I was going to stay at Hampshire because I didn't know if my scholarship would be valid to stay. And so it occurred to me that I wanted to do some research on the Mexican community in New York. As a Mexican who had migrated there when I was a child, and my parents and my brothers still living there, I figured that would be a pursuit worth taking. But there was not a whole lot out there about the community. And so I had to dig around, and when I found Professor Smith's research, at that point it was a thesis that he had written, I just felt full of emotion because it acknowledged my existence, my presence in this country and in this city that I knew as my home. And this is why in the thesis, Professor Smith had included his email, and I decided, you know what, I'm going to reach out to him. And surely he did respond. And that started my connection with Rob, Professor Smith. I don't think none of us would have imagined that 15 years later I would become his student, and then I would be here sharing my journey with all of you today. So I want to say thank you, Professor Smith, for everything you've done for me and for our community. Today I want to thank, of course, Baruch for bringing me back so soon. It's nice to be back and to be here to share some of my recent experiences. And also, of course, to the Engelman family. Thank you so much for your generosity and for making this possible. This lecture just seems so timely. The things that we can provide back to this community in the conversations that we can have are so important in the moment that we're living in today. My hope for today is not so much give you data, information about day laborers, the number of day laborers here. Professor Hector Cordero is in the room. He's got a tremendous amount of research done in that community, nor data unlike dreamers. Professor Smith has a tremendous amount of research in that area. But I wanted to take the opportunity to give you an inside look on someone who is working underground in the community, who is thinking through and grappling through what's going on with immigrants today. And thinking about strategies to empower immigrants and make sure that this community is able to overcome some of the aggressive attacks to them today. and also share my own journey as an undocumented student, an undocumented person, as a dreamer. It's something I often don't do. Over time, I decided that I would take a backseat and allow the younger dreamers to share their stories, but today felt just right. In part because this is a good time to evaluate where are we in the movement, not just dreamers, but people who are interested in the immigrant community. For me, this is a good time to think about the people that are being left behind, the people whose stories are not being lifted. The stories of the day laborers, for instance, the stories of those people who are being picked off the street and deported overnight. It is important for us to consider those narratives as well. And so I'd like to share some of the insights that I've gathered over these past couple of years in my life as an activist in this movement. So let me begin by sharing the story of Edgar Pasmino. Edgar found nice about a year ago. A friend of his told him about the organization. Edgar's pictured in the middle. His friends are there with him. We're here at May Day last year, almost exactly a year ago. These are our banners, that's our shirt. We're at Foley Square, we're celebrating May Day. We're out there showing a force of unity in our community. So he had found nice because a friend told him, well, you can go to this organization and get your training there. Why go pay for the training at some school that's probably going to overcharge you? You can go to NICE, get it for free. This health and safety training that Rob had mentioned is something that is required of construction workers to be able to work in the industry in this country and in New York. And Edgar came, and he was completely enthusiastic. He was so happy to have found an organization like NICE, but the people who belong to NICE and be able to belong to an organization, belong to a community that was fighting for the rights of immigrants and fighting for people like him. And I had a chance to have a conversation with Edgar when he first joined, and it was a great conversation, very inspiring to me, because he was just so happy to have found the organization. He took the health and safety training, and a week later, he also took a scaffolding training. It's not a required training, but it was something he wanted to do because he wanted the training. It was the same day as May Day, and then later in the day, he came out to this rally. Unfortunately, a couple of months ago, Edgar shared with his coworkers that he was afraid for his life. The job he was currently working at had some problems with the Department of Building. They had stopped the work site from operating. And apparently only a few workers were working at that site at the moment. And he felt fear for his life because they were doing some work he didn't really feel comfortable or prepared to do. But he had a tough choice. Does he tell his employer, I don't want to continue and risk being fired and losing his job? Or does he continue to work despite the risk? Unfortunately, Edgar chose to continue working at the site. A few days later, after he had shared with his friends the fear for his life, a forklift killed him, and he lost his life. Now, this was very difficult, of course, on his family and his friends and his colleagues. It was extremely difficult on the organization and on the people that work closely with workers and with members like Edgar, because this is exactly the kind of thing we try to avoid and that we fight for. I wanted to start with Edgar's story because tomorrow is May Day. Tomorrow is a year to the date that this picture was taken. And we will be marching in honor of Edgar. We will be out in the streets just as he would have been had he been alive today. And we will be asking the city and the state to do something about this crisis. Many of you might not have heard of this or might not have not known about this issue before tonight, but almost 500 workers have died in the past decade in a similar way as Edgar died 2 months ago. And this is a complete crisis. Had this been another profession, you would be seeing this on the news more often, and you would be seeing action from legislators. But unfortunately, construction workers, immigrant workers are thought of as disposable. And often they are blamed for for accidents that are completely preventable. And so tomorrow we will be marching in his honor, and we will be demanding the city and the state to take action. Just last week, we celebrated the Mass for the construction workers killed in the last year. This is at St. Patrick's Cathedral. We filled up the cathedral with construction workers. And we celebrated and remember the lives of the construction workers who've died in the past year. And as I said, 500 in the past decade, and we held a Mass in their honor and read their names. And so I wanted to start here because it shows how timely this is, how unfortunately we lose people and they're often forgotten. And it's just a reminder of the work that we do. They had at the cathedral helmets that symbolized the lives of all those who died. Edgar's family couldn't make it to the Mass, and so I had a chance to go up and pick up the helmet and walked in the procession on his behalf. And this has impacted me and my colleagues because he was a close member of the organization. And so it makes me think about why I do this work and why I got started to do this work and what has led me to come and become the director of New Immigrant Community Empowerment. And I have a long story to share about this, but it really begins as an undergrad. I was actually an intern at NICE 15 years ago. And the experience that I had at NICE when I was first an intern there really left a mark in me. As I said, I was an undergraduate at Hampshire College, and I went there to study film. And I wanted to make documentary films to share the stories of the people that I had been, that had grown up in neighborhood of Sunset Park in Brooklyn. But I realized that I couldn't do that with my life. I felt that I needed to do something for my community, and I needed to do something that I could bring my family and the rest of my community along. And so I applied for an internship at NICE. And once I was accepted and I began that internship, I was paired with a community organizer there. The community organizer, the first assignment he gave me was to work with the Sikh community who had been victims of hate crimes. This is right after 9/11. And as an intern, I experienced, I was able to meet people who had been victims of hate crimes. I had a chance to go visit their family members who had been beaten, who had been abused by people in the community that didn't want to see them around. And so that left a mark in me. And when I went back to school, I began to organize. I began to organize with the Immigrant Workers Freedom Ride. And at the time, this is 2003, again, the concept of Dreamer didn't exist yet. And so I gathered a group of friends at Hampshire, and I realized that I needed to educate more people about uh, what was happening in the community. And so we connected with a group of organizers from across the country, and we organized buses to New York City for a rally. So that was my first experience in sharing my story and sharing with other people what was the undocumented community going through. Uh, Later in 2006, I had a chance to organize during the 2006 mass mobilization where thousands of people came out to march against this anti-immigrant law that was being proposed in Congress. I was able to organize the rally in Massachusetts. And while I was organizing that rally, I was able to share that other cities were organizing mass mobilizations at the same time. Then later, I joined the DREAM Act movement. Of course, by then, more people began to share their stories. More people began to come out and share that they were undocumented, that perhaps they couldn't go to school because they didn't qualify for federal grants and support to go to school, or maybe the colleges that they wanted to go to didn't accept them or didn't allow undocumented students. I share this image because it's an iconic image of documented dreamers or students participating in civil disobedience in the Capitol. And this was very inspiring for for dreamers who were participating in this movement. And it was very much the reason why I continue to organize with my community. By 2010, we were fighting for the DREAM Act in Congress. We were organizing rallies, bringing buses to Washington, D.C. Professor Smith joined one of these rallies. And by 2012, by 2010, the DREAM Act had not passed, and so we continued to fight, and by 2012, we were able to win DACA. And this came about because of organizing, this came about because of bringing people together, and coincidentally, in 2012, we brought dreamers together to think about what kind of tactics would push the Obama administration to organize or to achieve the DREAM Act. And we were organizing possible occupations of campaign offices, and coincidentally, this is how we were able to achieve DACA in 2012. So I share this because this is a time that we're evaluating how we've organized as dreamers, how we've organized as a community to achieve these wins. When I was applying for the role of executive director at NICE, I realized that perhaps in the Dreamer movement, or in the time that we were fighting for dreamers, we had forgotten to lift the voices of day laborers and other immigrant communities. And so at the time, I was organizing for the passage of comprehensive immigration reform. These are some of the rallies that I was part of organizing. We realized that this was not moving along. We realized that in our fight for comprehensive immigration reform, and in our fight for our communities, we were not gaining any traction. And so um, I decided that, despite all of our attempts, despite all of our efforts, and despite the civil disobedience that we were engaging in, um, that we needed to go back to the local communities that we belong to, organize and to lift up the voices of some of the most vulnerable and some of the most um, uh, disempowered members of our community. And so I took the role of executive director at NICE because exactly of that thinking. When I had the opportunity, I took the role and I began to organize. I went back to NICE, I went back to my roots, and at that point, NICE, New American Community Empowerment, was still organizing vulnerable workers, vulnerable communities. And at that moment, NICE had evolved from working with victims of hate crimes, victims of uh, uh, of, uh, of of the anti-immigrant billboards and the anti-immigrant signage that was being put up in the neighborhood to work with day laborers. Now, day laborers had been a community that was in Jackson Heights, in the neighborhood where NICE is located, for many years, actually for many decades. And these day laborers, mostly construction workers, mostly workers who are working by the day and working in temporary jobs, are often misunderstood. There's a stereotype that day laborers are mostly men, mostly workers who are looking for work in the street corners and at home improvement, home improvement centers. But in fact, day laborers are people who work on a temporary basis that perhaps of their immigration status, they are working in jobs that are unstable, that jobs where they can get fired, or who are not permanent. And so day laborers can also include women who are looking for jobs at employment agencies, who are looking for jobs through family networks, through friends, and through other means. And so NICE has been working with this community since 2006, when it transitioned to a membership organization, acknowledging that so many of the people that seeked their services were day laborers and people who were looking for jobs at employment agencies. And so day laborers are, the day laborers that we work with are primarily Latin American, primarily arriving from southern Mexico or Ecuador, Colombia, Venezuela, the Dominican Republic, and most recently immigrants from South Asia and Africa. And so the day laborers that we work with are primarily defined by the lack of immigration status. A lot of them have arrived recently, but some of them have been in the country for 10, 15, 20, 30 years. People who have not been able to achieve a relief through comprehensive immigration reform since the last opportunity to do that was in 1986. And so they face a tremendous amount of obstacles as a community. They face workplace exploitation. Because of their status, they enter into relationships with employers that are often abusive, that often have them working in jobs that are dangerous, that are unsafe, and are often not paid what they were promised or not paid at all. Employers use different tactics to be able to exploit these workers, knowing that because of their status, they are less likely to leave the jobs. less likely to say something about the conditions they have them working in. The population that we work with are also victims of services fraud, primarily from abusive and fraudulent employment agencies. Employment agencies that are technically regulated by the Department of Consumer Affairs and by the state, but many of these employment agencies are unlicensed, and they utilize schemes to be able to take advantage of workers that are in desperate situations looking for work. These communities are also victims of fraudulent lawyers or people who pretend to be lawyers, who pretend to help and support communities, immigrant communities, but instead often lie to them, submit applications or claim to submit applications for money, and often they disappeared without providing any support or any relief to the immigrants that seek their support. And so with the employment agencies, what often happens is that a worker goes and finds a job, maybe they get sent out on a job, and the employment agency charges $40, the job pays maybe $80 or $100. So even though the employer is paying minimum wage after the fee, the workers are often working under that minimum wage. Access to services, because these communities are often targets of police and are often targets of authorities, particularly day laborers. They fear accessing certain services, such as homeless shelters, which is often a necessary lifeline for them if perhaps they couldn't find work and are left homeless, or after years of not visiting the doctor, they are afraid of visiting the doctor. So just general access to services, critical services, is a significant obstacle and something that workers come to us for quite often. And so I share this because although these communities go through a lot in their lives, and despite all the challenges, these workers are often more than willing to come together to organize and to build campaigns and to fight for what they think is just. And so what we do at NICE is convene workers and worker committees to organize around campaigns. We provide services, but we provide services in a way that that immigrant workers are also participants in, for instance, developing a worker center where together they organize jobs and organize teams of workers who go out on jobs and together protect themselves, each other, from being exploited at job sites. And so just to describe a few of, this is a group of workers at a job site. Just to describe a few of the victories that as an organization we've been able to achieve in the past couple of years. NICE led a campaign to reform employment agencies at the state level. And this campaign brought light to the fraud that was occurring as a result of employment agencies in the schemes that they were running in these communities. And so as a result of workers running a community education campaign, this is a graphic novel that a group of workers came together with organizers. They put it together and they published it through El Diario La Prensa and other news outlets. Because of this and the stories that they were able to share back to the elected officials, back to community leaders, they were able to get the support of enough legislators to pass employment agency reform at the state level, which gained bipartisan support. It was one of the few laws that passed the state legislature in the last 5 years that was immigrant friendly. And what it did is prevented employment agencies from charging upfront fees when workers were offered to be sent to jobs. What often would happen is that the employer or the employment agency would charge a worker $100, $200 for a job that didn't exist, and then the employee or the worker would come to an organization like NICE saying, well, I lost my money there and I never saw a job. And so that's what the law does. It prevents employment agencies from charging this upfront fee. What happens though, now employment agencies are often charging a whole week's pay from workers, or even 2 or up to 3 weeks of salaries. And so these are schemes that they've been able to develop as an organization and as a comité. The workers are now conducting mystery shopping where they're going to these employment agencies, seeing that whether they're following the new law, whether they're engaging in other schemes, and we're collecting this data to then later publish it in a report and demonstrate whether this law is effective or whether we need to pursue more legislation or more reform in the employment agency sector. Another huge victory that we were able to achieve with workers in the past couple of years was the recognition by the city that day laborers are a significant labor force in the city. After Superstorm Sandy, day laborers were an important workforce in helping rebuild some of the areas that had been affected by the superstorm, including Far Rockaway, Coney Island, the South Shore on Staten Island. Immigrant workers, day laborers went out there to work where other workers wouldn't. And so in the past couple of years, we were able to achieve support from the city council to be able to fund a day labor worker center that across at NICE in Queens and across the 5 boroughs. We've been able to achieve this because of the organizing that the members have done to be able to go and educate elected officials, city council members, the mayor, that this labor, the labor that they able to provide to the city is invaluable. They're often second responders in times of natural disasters. This was a significant victory for this community because they now have a center in which they can come and congregate. They now have a center where they can come and take trainings. They can come and shelter themselves from severe weather conditions. They have access to facilities. They have access to clean water, whereas before they didn't have any of this. And so what you're seeing here is one of the corners, paradas, that we organize workers at. The other great victory that we've been able to achieve through community organizing is a wage theft campaign where workers identify some of the major issues that they were dealing with, and they realized that wage theft was by far the most significant one, because when they're not paid the wages that they're promised, or where they're not paid the complete amount agreed upon, then they can't pay their rent, they can't pay for their expenses, and often that leads to a lot of issues in their own personal lives and in their family lives. So they decided that that would be the major campaign, that they would do something about it, and they wanted to use technology. And so they came together to develop an application. Community organizers and artists and technologists came together and developed this application where they would use to gather data, gather the information when they went out on jobs. They gathered photos of the folks, the automobiles, the vans that would pick them up at the street corners. And this was a significant achievement. This was a first of its kind. It was widely covered. And in addition, they decided that they would start a campaign that would try to hold employers accountable by asking the city to say that if you are an employer and decided to steal the wages of your workers, and we can prove that through judgments against you, through fines and through citations given to you, if you've put your workers at risk, then you would your license would be revoked or suspended. And so I want to show you this video. If I can get it to play. Oh, there we go. This is a segment that covers, that describes the app that we developed with the day laborers. This also shows you some of the workers that we work with and some of the street corners that we're organizing at. And it also shows you a little bit of our day-to-day work at NICE.
It's daybreak in Queens, New York. Day laborers gather to wait for work here, like at hundreds of other sites across the United States.
We're located next to one of the largest day labor corners in the country.
Manuel Castro is the executive director of NICE, the new Immigrant Community Empowerment Center that serves this worker population here.
Many of them are undocumented immigrants. They're new to the city. They have a lot of barriers. You know, language is one of them.
Even when there's work, says Castro, there may not be a wage.
Wage theft involves a worker going out to a job, working a couple of hours a day or even weeks, and not getting the wages they agreed on or getting paid at all.
It's a risk workers like Victor Galindo take on a daily basis.
They say they'll pay you. They say come tomorrow. But then they change their telephone numbers, change everything, and disappear, and we don't get our money.
But now NICE is heading up a project to stop wage theft and other abuses with a virtual way for workers to fight back.
You know, you can identify the model of the car, the color.
A smartphone app, 3 years in the making with the help of funding from the Ford Foundation and a construction workers union.
And now it's not just going to operate here in these neighborhoods, but it's going to go national.
The jornalero, Spanish for day laborer, will allow workers to keep easy records of wages agreed to and hours worked right on their phones. It will help them identify employers by things like vehicle type and license plate, and will even document dangerous conditions at work sites. And if there's a problem, a worker can send an instant system-wide alert to warn others on the app. Attorney Diana Marin represents victims of wage theft.
Often scenario that I have is when I'm negotiating with employer for unpaid wages, they simply say, I don't know who he is, prove to me that he worked for me.
She says the app could be a game changer because her clients will now have documentation.
It's a new component, right? And it really is going to be a powerful one. I mean, they already are sharing information, but it's very informal. It's not in this kind of systematic collecting of data.
Testing will begin this month. Activist Sol Agamende, who helped conceive of the idea, says the power it puts in workers' hands goes far beyond their daily wages.
It's a tool for education. While you learn how to use it, you also learn about your rights. Makes you feel that you're not alone in the corner and you are part of a movement.
Erica Pizzi, Al Jazeera, New York. It's daybreak.
So the workers were able to achieve this only because they were able to come together and think about strategies to tackle some of the day-to-day struggles that they were facing. And technology was only one of the options, but they developed several different tactics to be able to tackle this problem. And one of the most significant tactics that they developed is being able to have organizing support for when an employer steals their wages and then they want to negotiate to get this money back. So what often happens is that when a day laborer or construction worker comes to NICE with a wage theft campaign, we don't just send people to a legal service provider, but we actually sit down with the worker and we call the employer and we say, well, this worker is a member of ours. We're calling because you agreed to pay them a certain amount or you haven't paid them, and we try to negotiate the money back then. Often that is successful. Employers, often subcontractors, realize that the workers have support from an organization, and then they agree to pay them back. They agree to meet them somewhere and pay them back for their wages. This app has been an interesting development. It's something that we partner with the National Day Laborer Organizing Network to produce. It is now being used in 7 different states. And it's still, honestly, in a pilot phase. We're trying to assess how useful it is for workers, how accessible it is for all workers. We're trying to develop other technologies, and we're trying to figure out whether using an application like this one or using an existing application like WhatsApp to send alerts to workers who are connected through that existing app is better. So it's a work in progress, but we've been able to achieve this through a lot of intense organizing with workers, with committees, with people who have decided that they would take it upon themselves to do something about the situation they're living in. And so I wanted to show how workers are, despite all these obstacles that I shared, the daily lives that they live, are still able to come together, organize, and with the organization support, lift up the voices of some of the most vulnerable workers in our society. And I think that we're in a different moment with what's going on in our country. Just in the past couple of weeks in New York, immigrants have been targeted. We are seeing an increase, a number of raids in our communities, and we expect more. NICE has been one of the leading organizations in discussing what to do in case of workplace raids, what to do when immigration enforcement agencies come into the workplace and take possibly dozens of workers. How do we react as a community? How do we react as organizations? And where do we go from there? And so I believe that this is an interesting moment in the movement. This is an interesting moment in how we think of our movement moving forward. I believe that we need to put these workers and this community up front and center. We need to make sure that we're lifting up these stories. in that we're incorporating them in our work moving forward. I think the work that we did to develop the Dreamer movement was significant. It was something that we achieved through a lot of work in organizing, but at the end of the day, this is not what is going to get the entire community along to achieve actual relief to all the community. And so I want to say that if you talk to any of these workers who have been part of these organizing efforts, they tell you that they want to work with our communities to make sure that everyone's humanity is upheld, including theirs, of all workers that are fighting for justice in their community. They're not thinking just about themselves, but they're thinking about others. And we should continue to organize with these communities. We should make sure that they're included in our movement, in our conversations moving forward, and not allow them to be targeted and further driven down into the shadows. Because what we're living through right now has the potential of really harming our community, and we need to make sure that we're highlighting some of the issues that I've highlighted here today, and to know that there's a possibility to organize and achieve a lot of great things with these workers. And so I want to conclude there. Thank you so much for listening to me and allowing me to share my story and the story of NICE and the workers who participate. And I hope that hopefully tomorrow I see some of you at the May Day rally in Washington Square Park. Thank you so much.